When I originally painted these peaches, um, and here's the finished painting here. What I tried to do was paint something with a certain surface texture, and in this case, being the peach fuzz, which is soft and has a certain quality to it, and demonstrate that even though if you look at the peaches up close in detail, you see the peach fuzz and it looks soft and everything else, that actually when you paint, as long as you put a texture in your painting, it really doesn't matter what that texture is, so long as your values and your colors are right. And I've got some other videos where I demonstrate this, and I could show you examples. But for instance, if you can even see polished marble, and an artist might paint it with a real choppy brushwork, looks nothing like polished marble. But as long as he has his values right and his colors right, when you step back across the room, it looks like polished marble. It's almost a magical thing about painting. So in this painting here, what I'm doing is I'm just laying in my values. I'm not thinking at all about soft peach fuzz, and at no point will I attempt to try to paint that peach fuzz in detail. And I know there's artists out there that paint ultra realism and photorealism, in the extreme. And there's nothing wrong with that if that's the type of painting that you like. But in the painting that I demonstrate and sort of try to do myself is where you just lay in your colors, you lay in your values, you leave in a certain amount of brushwork, and you leave a certain amount of surface texture, which is the brushwork, and you don't blend it all up and make it a big smooth, whatever it is. If you, as soon as you start blending everything together, you lose the surface texture, you lose the brushwork, and it becomes a soft, blurry, whatever that your brain isn't able to fixate and isn't able to see the surface of. So you've got to have a little bit of, edginess, a little bit of delicate brushwork, or whatever, that you can stare into it and see some texture. And you can already see that in the bottom of this peach that I'm painting. And in this case, I am not doing this strictly according to the method that I teach. My method for teaching is very strict, and I'm allowing myself some liberties here. I didn't pre-mix my colors, for instance. I'm just mixing them as I need them, and just kind of playing around on my palette. And I would encourage any of my students who've been using my method for 20 paintings or whatever to try to paint this way. The method that I teach for beginners is a method where you mix your rows of color ahead of time, and you really focus in on understanding how to mix your colors accurately and everything else. But once you've been painting for a while, I think there's nothing in the world wrong with just going out there and just mixing your colors on the fly and doing whatever. Because now that I've been doing this a long time, and this goes for anybody that's been doing my method for a long time, and I've painted portraits for years, and only in the very beginning did I really strictly adhere to color mixing ahead of time and everything else. Later on, as I started painting portraits, I began to play with my colors more and more. And even if I did pre-mix some colors, which I often did pre-mix a certain number of them, I would definitely play with them and kind of discover as I painted that I needed colors that I didn't mix or whatever. And I still encourage people to do that, to mix your colors. Even if you mix perfect rows of color, when you start to paint, you're always going to find variation and little differences. And in the case of these peaches, there's crazy variation. There's purple, there's red, orange, yellow, blue. I mean, there's really almost everything in there. Maybe not pure blue, but there's definitely some grays as the peach fuzz goes around the edge. So this was an especially, if I were to mix these color groups, there would be 3 or 4 in these peaches just because they're just such different colors. Um, and that goes for apples and a lot of other fruit too that can be, you can even find an orange that on one side is completely green and the other side is completely orange. So there's multiple color groups in a lot of fruit, um, but peaches are especially wide-ranging in their color. So now I'm just putting in some background. And another thing that I did that was unorthodox, or I should say not strictly according to the method that I teach for beginning artists, is that I normally insist that my students put in some background around whatever they're painting. And so I started to paint that peach without any background around it. And that would be something I would encourage my students to not do. And that's because you can really judge the value so much better when you have some color around whatever it is. And you can also push it around easier. If you make a mistake and your peach gets a little fat, you can bump it on the left and the right and make it thinner. So this is very much me just kind of doing my thing. I painted these peaches without any thought to trying to demonstrate my method. I've got plenty of other videos that do that. But really the main emphasis again is that I wanted to show that if you leave some brush work in, you never have to get around to painting the surface of anything. Just leave in a little bit of texture and you can forget about painting the peach fuzz or the strawberry seeds or whatever it is. And there are a lot of great examples that I've given in other videos where you can look at great art, the strawberries, for instance, and then look at how they're painted. And there was nobody ever, or the artist didn't paint the surface itself. They didn't paint the little seeds and the little hairs that are in strawberry skin or any of that. They just painted an abstract texture with good values and good color, and then your brain fills it in. So, and that's really important to understand because it all goes back to this thing I've also talked about in other videos about painting ugly, and that is that when you're up close staring at a painting and there's a lot of brush work, you're not going to see the peach fuzz. You're not, and so you tend to, especially if you're the artist who's working on it and who's painting it, as part of that artist curse, when you're staring at your painting up close, you see, the ugly surface or the ugly brushwork. And what you don't realize is that if you step back, 10 feet, it all turns into, a beautiful still life. But you can't see it when you're up close, so you tend to overwork things and, overblend and overfix. And in the process, you milk all your values up and your colors up, which are far more important than trying to paint a bunch of super detail. So I hope this painting will demonstrate that. One of the things, and I've talked about this also in other videos in terms of color theory and everything, but if you ever have a milky color, and if you look at the bottom of this peach, for instance, it is not milky, and I would say that a lot of people would end up with a milky color. So whenever you have milk is sort of a gray, and so you could almost think of milk as being, your color as being too blue, because grays are basically blues, dirty blues. So the bottom of that peach really has almost no milk in it, and where it does, it's on the edge where you start to pick up the grays. But that deep orange there in the middle on the bottom is a color that, once it gets a little bit of white in it, you can't make it. It's just burnt umber, red, yellow, and those are colors, if you look at your color wheel, that are on the orange side. And so the opposite of milk is orange, the color orange. And if you look at burnt umber on the color wheel, it's right on the orange side of the color wheel. So if you ever have a dark shadow that looks milky, You could add orange to it, but orange is going to bring the value up if you've got a lot of cadmium yellow in it or whatever. So if you have a dark color and it looks milky shadows or whatever, throw some burn umber into it while it's still wet, and that burn umber will get rid of the milk. So burn umber is a good, anytime you see a milky color, it just means that it's too blue, too gray, which is the same as too blue. Just throw a little burn umber into it and the milk will disappear. And if it's in the mid-range or upper value color, some of the lighter colors, then you can just use orange to get rid of milk. But milk tends to appear in people's shadows, and that's because white is, it just gets into everything. So your highlights have got white in it, and all it takes is just a dirty brush, drag through a shadow area, and it'll just turn to milk in a second. It doesn't take almost any white at all to get in there and milk it up. So whenever I paint free like this, and I just kind of mix my colors as I need them, I'm thinking about all of those things. And if I see an area that's looking too gray, then I'm just going to throw orange into it. But these peaches, I tell you what, there were a lot of colors. I found myself spending a lot of time on my palette. And, I've one of the things that I try to make the strong point to my students is that, and I don't show this in my videos, because if I showed you how much time on my palette I spend, I don't think I'd get as many views, because it would be a pretty boring video to a lot of people. I try to give you a good flavor of my time on the palette, but there's a lot of palette time that I don't show you, and I would say that I spend more time on my palette than I do on my canvas, and I'd say that without any doubt. And that was something I heard, and I've mentioned this in a video, but there's a story about Sargent and how he was painting a portrait of this of a girl's, I think it was her sister, or maybe it was her aunt or somebody, a family member that was having their portrait done by Sargent, and they were observing the whole thing, and they wrote a letter to another relative and mentioned that it was very unexpected to see Sargent spending so much time mixing his colors, that he would, hold out a brush and run back and forth to the subject, and spend a lot of time on his palette mixing colors. And that's, if you think about it, it makes sense, because, really, you can just get up there and push the colors that are already on your canvas around and paint with a dirty brush. But if you really want to be deliberate with your colors and to get all the nuance, you've got to go and spend some time on your palette. And when I do portraits especially, I might mix some colors to start with, but by the time I'm done, I've completely run out of space, and I've adjusted and mixed all kinds of variation. And that's true for, skin tends to be that way. It has all kinds of different shades in it, something like a peach in a way. Noses are red, cheeks are red, foreheads are less red, chins and necks are less red, and so you get that variation. So now I'm mixing up a new color, which I believe is going to be, to get this a little bit of background put in around this peach that I'm about to start on. And I did do some color checking in this video. I did not record any of that because I didn't have the third camera set up, but I did do some color checking, and I always recommend to my students who are starting out that they, what I say is check every stroke, and that may seem tedious and very slow when you're starting out, but it's a great way to develop good habits. And then as you paint more and more, you'll speed up and you won't need to check every stroke. So I checked a little bit to generally I like to get my bearings, and then once I get started, I can kind of be more, um, just going by instinct. But if you're starting out, I absolutely recommend checking every stroke before you paint it, and that's how you learn to see value and to see color. I think I've painted this silver dish in 2 or 3 different demos. Um, I guess I like it. And I painted this painting many months ago. I used it for another demo talking about surface texture, but I just wanted you guys to be able to see the whole thing. And I'm not showing you every stroke for sure. This is very much condensed, but I try to show you the enough of it so you can kind of see exactly how I painted it. So now I've decided to paint the rest of the silver lid here just because it surrounds the peaches, and really should have painted some fabric in around the silver in the first place. Um, it's just really just taking shortcuts, but it's always better to have some background around an object before you paint it. So one of the things that I do when I'm painting and I'm laying in my color is on the first layer, so to speak, and sometimes there's only, and when I mean layer, I mean the first, when you first try to cover the canvas with paint, I try not to think too much about, does this look like a peach? I'm really only making value decisions. I'm asking, is the value that I'm putting in the correct value? I'm not asking myself, is this looking like peach or the skin of a peach? The whole point is that if you get your values right and you don't overblend and you leave a little bit of texture in there, it's going to look like a peach. And so when you're once you do get the canvas covered, and you're trying to decide whether something looks right or not, even at that point, I always just look into my values and I make value corrections or shape corrections. But what I don't do is look at detail and start staring into, the fuzz on the peach, or whether it's a texture in a fabric or whatever it is, and try to make it look like the other. You'll go crazy. The only way to paint that way is to take it, all the way to the extreme and get into almost photorealism or extremely tight painting, where you almost have to get out a needle brush. So it's better just to lay it down, leave it alone, and always focus on the values. When you step back away from your painting and you're 10 feet away, the only thing that matters to the viewer are value mistakes. So when you step back and you're 6 or 10 feet away from your painting, even then you shouldn't look into it and say, does that look like fabric? Because of the artist's curse and because of the fact that you've painted it, as you lay in your color, you lose your objectivity, you have a hard time seeing it. But if you'll just focus on the value problems, in other words, you look into a shadow and you say, my shadow's too light, my shadow's too dark, or whatever it is, then the object will begin to look realistic, and it will begin to look like whatever it is you're painting, all by itself, just by solving the value problems. And it's something that I learned to do naturally over years of painting portraits, but it's something that only, I guess, in the last couple of years have I been able to sort of express it in words. And simply that. Let me repeat it because it's worth repeating. In fact, I should make a whole video on this. And that is that when I am trying to decide, as I am here, as I'm painting in these shadow colors, I am not thinking, does this look like a peach? I'm not thinking, does this look like the skin of the peach? Or do I see the fuzz on the surface, or whatever it is? And this goes for fabric or for anything else. I'm simply looking in to my painting and I'm making value decisions. And that can be, if you're starting out, that's a lot of color checking. So the question I have as I put this little mark here on this peach is the value correct? And that's something I can check by color checking if I don't have an instinct for it. But solving those value problems that's the whole ball game, because once you get the canvas covered, if all your values are right, it'll look like a peach. One of the reasons I show my completed paintings at the beginning of my video, of all my videos, whenever I do a video where I do a demonstration of me painting a painting and showing it through completion, I always show the painting finish at the beginning. And that's because if I were to just let the viewer watch me paint it and watch it develop the whole time, they would, in a sense, get a little bit of the artist's curse like I have as I've painted it. And what I mean is, imagine, when I finish it as this painting, you've already seen this painting. If you watch the beginning of this video, I showed you the peaches, and if you like my style of painting, you might have said, "Well, that's a really nice painting of some peaches." But if you watch me paint the whole thing, and then at the end I declare it finished, you're very likely to say, "Oh, he forgot. Why didn't he ever fix that corner there where the brushwork is, or why didn't he ever put the peach fuzz in like I expected him to do, or why didn't he ever fix that ugly shadow that's all rough?" And so that's the critical mind that makes those sorts of judgments. The way you get away from that critical mind is you simply fix your value problems, or put in your values the way they were, and you simply do not worry about the surface and do not make it look pretty. Because to the viewer from a distance who walks in and didn't see you paint it and watch the whole thing, the painting will look great to them. So as part of the way that I teach, I say that I have 3, or really actually 4 workflows, or you could even say 4 different flow charts for how you do all the different parts of finishing an oil painting. And the first one is laying in your pencil lines, which I did not film in this video. The second one is preparing your palette, which does not mean that you're mixing all of your colors. It just means that you're pre-mixing the key colors in whatever you're painting, in this case peaches, and that's a second workflow or flow chart that you would follow. And then the third workflow that you would follow is covering the canvas, which is what I'm doing here. And when you're covering the canvas and you're checking your colors, and if you're just starting, I encourage my students to check every single stroke. And that means if you're using a color checker, you're holding out your color checker and you're investigating and seeing what the color looks like. And if you're working from a laminated photo, you can just wipe the paint right on the photo. But anyway, that's the third workflow, covering the canvas, which is what I'm doing now. And one of the things that I reiterate with my students, and I emphasize over and over, is that when they're doing that, that workflow, as I'm doing now, covering the canvas, you're really not supposed to judge your work and decide whether it's looking pretty or whether the shadow's too dark or whether you think the colors are looking right. You just sort of blindly follow your color checking and lay it in. But then the fourth workflow, which is the workflow of once the canvas is covered, which I haven't gotten to yet in this painting, once you're at that point and the entire canvas is covered and you've maybe you painted it sloppy, maybe you've got a lot of brush work in there that doesn't look like it belongs or whatever it is, but once the canvas is covered, you completely change gears and you move into the new workflow, which is what's the difference, is what I call it. But it's where you look at your source, whether it's a photo or whether you're working from live, and you ask, what is the difference between my painting and the source? And here's the key about that, is that if I bring in somebody off of the streets and they look at my finished painting when I've just covered the canvas, but I haven't really tried to work it or anything else, they can make judgments about that just as well as anybody. In other words, if I come in and I ask somebody right now, what do you think about the color of this peach? And because the canvas isn't covered, they will very likely misjudge it and say, well, it looks like it's this or that, especially when you're just first starting to put in the shadows. If I bring somebody in who doesn't know how to paint, they will tell me that the shadow, looks too dark when it's really not too dark. That's if the canvas is not covered. But once the canvas is covered, they can look at your source and they can look at your painting, and you can do this yourself, and you can decide, you can clearly see whether the shadow is too dark in your painting or whether it's too light or whatever it is. In other words, you can make value judgments very well with your eye. You don't even have to have a trained eye once the canvas is covered. But before the canvas is covered, you will make the wrong judgment one after another. And if you go back in this video that you're watching, of these peaches, and you look at the peach especially when the shadows are just being put in, you might think, well, the shadow looks too dark, or that doesn't look right, or whatever else. But once the canvas is covered, then I can ask you, does the shadow look too dark? And you'll be able to see it just as well as I can. So that is all to say that covering the canvas and blindly following your color checking and not making value judgments as you go along, not fixing as you go along, not overworking your canvas, but simply putting in your spots of paint, just like I've done here on this peach, and that's going to get you. And then at that point, you can go into that fourth workflow, which is, what's the difference? And that's when you can have the judgment to see that. So here I am. I'm just filling in the silver, which, again, I should have done that in the beginning. I don't know why I did not paint background in. When I set off, when I decided to paint these peaches, I decided beforehand that I would paint it sort of my own way. I decided I would paint some, pretty realistic peaches, but that I was just going to do it using my own free workflow where I don't follow my method. If you want to follow my method and you want to learn how to paint, I would strongly encourage you to go watch one of my 3 videos. I've got 3 videos on my Draw Mix Paint site, and they're YouTube videos. You can go search for them in my video list. But how to paint in oil, how to draw in proportion, and how to mix colors. And those 3 videos are the core workflows that I've been talking about. And there's no secret to it. It's just it's pretty simple. I'm gonna make a video here soon, I hope, where I just go through each one of those workflows sort of quickly, bullet point by bullet point, and just kind of go through it quickly, and then I just so you can see sort of an overview of my whole method, and I think that'll be helpful. So this video is about 35 minutes long, the painting part of it, but I think it took me, when just the camera's rolling, I think it was about almost 8 hours to paint these peaches, which was way longer than I really originally thought. I thought I was just going to knock them out and not get too tight with it, but I ended up deciding I wanted to really push it. And anyway, so I just worked on them more than I thought I would, and I ended up spending about 8 hours on this painting, which then I cut down to 35 minutes. So the parts you don't see is me wiping my brush off, me changing my brushes, so any color checking that I do, I did not include. And but what I try to do is, instead of just running the camera in super fast speed, where it's I think it's better if I run it at normal speed, but then kind of skip the parts, that you can kind of figure out what I'm doing. Like here, you can see how I'm kind of filling in the table. This is where I can really, the table, for instance, I was a lot more just kind of doing whatever I wanted to do, and it wasn't trying to copy the table verbatim or anything. And same thing with the cloth. So it really didn't take me any time to paint the table. I mean, it probably took me in real time maybe 10, 15 minutes. I don't know, maybe longer. I don't remember exactly. But here, in the peaches, I was really trying to be much more careful about getting my values and colors right. I think part of it was just the pressure, knowing I was being filmed and that everybody was going to be judging my colors and all the rest. Whenever I paint without cameras rolling, I find it a little more enjoyable in terms of not having to even think about what I'm doing. Whereas when the cameras are rolling, I'm always thinking that you guys are judging my work as I go along, which is ridiculous. But so silver on reflections, a lot of times people think they're difficult, but that's an example of if you just get your values right and your colors right, you can just splotch in the paint any old way you want, and doesn't matter how you do it or even what the texture of the surface looks like. But if you get your values right in, it's going to look like metal. It's going to look like silver. And that reflection there is not quite as strong in my painting as it is in the source, that red peach reflection there on the left. But that's because I've decided not to paint that peach, and so it really doesn't even make sense why it's even there in the first place, but I just decided to leave a little bit of that red in there. So when you paint reflections, I very much hold off on the very brightest part of the shine. As you can see, that's the very last thing that I'm putting in, is that white bit. I've already taken the time to build the foundation. And like I'm here, I'm building the foundation for the bright shine. I'm sort of painting it with a lower value color, with not a super bright color first, and then I go back into it and put in the brighter bits. And I guess I skipped that in the filming here. I cut that part out, but I just basically will put the very lightest bits of any reflection into a base of other you never want to just take the reflection and lay it right on top of something dark, although I guess there are times when that is probably how reflection is, but it's extremely rare. In fact, I can't think of any time that I've ever seen a white reflection laid on top of a black or very dark background. There's always a little bit of something going on underneath the reflection. So this last peach, which is only a half peach, didn't take nearly as much time, of course, to put in. So in this peach painting, I just laid it in, and basically when I had finished covering the canvas, I don't think I made any changes whatsoever. I just decided to leave it exactly as it was. I might have gone in and touched it here or there, but I don't remember. I don't think I did. I think I just, finished up the silver. I'd forgotten to put the reflections on the lid there, so I just went back in and put that in. And then after I did that, I just left the peaches the way they were, even the little spot on the top there. And that was, again, going back to just making a good value judgment and deciding that they were going to be okay. All right, well, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.